All right, panel four. Panel four, Immigration and Families. I'm Sarah Shoppy-Sullivan from Ohio State University, and also the president of the Council on Contemporary Families. And I'm going to be the evil timekeeping person for this session. So first we have Bethany Letiecq speaking about Central American immigrant families still waiting on Washington, interlinking policy, and the everyday experiences of families. Hi. There you go. Figure this out here. Okay, so thank you. Thank you so much for having me here today. Very briefly, I'm going to talk about the current immigration policy context and the ways in which this context conditions and constrains the everyday lived experiences of Central American immigrant mothers. While I can't cover the immigration policy landscape in great detail, I do want to emphasize that there have been significant shifts in immigration policy over the decades, resulting in different immigration experiences across the generations, from open borders to circular migration to the current anti-immigrant policy context referred to as illegality. Today's policies deny many from accessing legal employment, as many of you know here, and obtaining driver's licenses. They exclude many from taking up a range of social benefits, including welfare, food stamps, Medicare, and Social Security, and they deny access to health insurance. So in the mid-1990s, Terry Rappick documented the growth of Central American families in the DC region. She noted that in the 60s and 70s, Central American immigrants, and particularly women, were recruited by Washington's diplomatic and professional elite to work for them as housekeepers and child care providers. Many settled in immigrant enclaves like the enclave known as Churilagua, reflecting its deep ties to El Salvador. Today, the Churilagua neighborhood is home to about 65% Central American immigrants, and nearly half of the residents earn less than $50,000 a year in a region where the median household income exceeds $140,000 per year. Now, this is where, in 2014, I joined with community members and my George Mason colleagues to form a community-based participatory action research, or PAR project, called Amigas de la Comunidad. Today, I want to focus on a recent article that grew out of our PAR partnership that examines how the immigration policy context, which reproduces structural racism, heteropatriarchy, and illegality, conditions and constrains undocumented immigrant mothers' working, living, and family functioning. Our findings reflect what happens when policies and laws rooted in structural racism, heteropatriarchy, and illegality intersect to foment oppressive working and housing conditions. They also foment predatory power relations. You can see these complexities in this one quote from Ariana when she says, "Others that know we are not from this country, that for $8 we will work in whatever, do jobs that we shouldn't be doing, and they see you as less and you allow it because you have no papers. The fear is that they will get immigration on you, and you think about your children, God forbid, better to bear it." Now, in our research, we've also documented a phenomenon that we call living with strangers, where essentially one family lives in one bedroom and another family lives in another bedroom, with others taking up space in the living room. There's typically a resident who is also the leaseholder. The others are subletters, which can result in unequal power relations, eviction threat, and constrained family functioning. As Alejandra suggests, when she said, "Well, yes, we try to not provoke the leaseholder family because right now we do not have another option. If they tell us to leave from there, then we have to leave. Sometimes the leaseholder family does not like for our children to bother them too much. Our children do not like it because it's so constraining. But we don't have any other place to live right now and could be evicted if we protest. As we have found, when structural oppressive forces intersect, it conditions and constrains the ways immigrant families do family. Now, of course, it's important to note that we also document how parents overcome and resist this oppression, but here I am focused on how an anti-immigrant policy context is particularly constraining for mothers. As Natalia's story suggests, my husband has never liked to have someone else take care of our daughters. Yet Natalia eventually does return to the paid labor market, and she shares, "So I said to my husband, I can't be here in the house all day. I have to be able to do something so I wouldn't feel so lonely. I got a part-time job, and maybe that's why it felt good, because I was making my own money and I could send some home to my folks." And Fernanda, I'm almost done. And Fernanda, seeking liberation from oppression, says, "It's just that I'm a bit complicated. I do not like for someone to tell me what to do. I do not like to be pressured. In other words, I like to be free, and in order to be free, I have to be alone." Consonant with PAR, we not only conduct research in partnership with Amigas, but we also take collective action. I'm obviously out of time. I'd be happy to discuss this with you further, and thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Our next speaker is on immigration, aging, and care is Zohra Ansari-Thomas, who's at Franklin and Marshall College.
Great. Hi, everyone. I'm going to talk today briefly on some topics related to immigration, aging, and care. So care, both care provided to children and care provided to older adults has been a central policy discussion during this election cycle. So just a couple examples here. We have everything from J.D. Vance proposing that grandparents should be the ones to step in and solve the childcare crisis in the United States, to Harris proposing some funding for at-home elderly care, and speaking about, the so-called sandwich generation, right? People who are kind of sandwiched between providing care to younger children and to older adults. But all to say that it's no question that we have a care crisis here in the United States. Childcare is becoming increasingly unaffordable for many families, and we've seen a shortage of childcare workers and adult care workers recently, especially made worse by the pandemic. And long-term adult care is similarly unaffordable, rarely covered by insurance, and family members in the U.S. tend to provide the bulk of primarily unpaid long-term care to aging individuals. And so there has been a lot of policy attention in recent years on immigration as kind of a solution to this care crisis, particularly considering our aging population and shortage of elder care. So the idea being that immigrants tend to keep our population relatively youthful, contribute to the labor force, and may actually contribute to the care economy as well through kind of more care workers coming in. But there's been an increased attention on the fact that, this idea of immigration as a solution to our population aging problem and to elder care crisis has a lot of problems with it, one of which being that immigrants are aging themselves, right? And often in a sort of socio-political context where they have very little support. So today I just wanted to very briefly, I know I don't have a lot of time, highlight just a little bit of findings from some work I've done on this area on the care needs and arrangements of aging immigrants living in the United States. So in the interest of time, I'm just going to show a couple descriptive graphs from this. I'm happy to talk more later. But here, what I do in this paper is I look at the prevalence of needing some sort of care among older adults, so those who are 65 and older, comparing people who were born in the U.S. To two groups of immigrants. So one in the blue line are what I'm calling earlier life migrants. So these are people who migrated to the United States when they were under the age of 50. So most of them migrated either in childhood or when they were young adults. compared to later life migrants, so this is the group in yellow, who came to the US when they were above the age of 50. And so we see some pretty big differences here, right? The later life migrants, those who came to the US at older ages, were much more likely to need some sort of care assistance at older age, including care for both activities of daily living and instrumental activities of daily living. And importantly, when we look at, so among those who need some sort of care, how are they receiving the care? Who is caring for them? Later life migrants were particularly likely to note that their adult child was the one who was caring for them, rather than a spouse or some other arrangement, which includes a paid caregiver. So to wrap up with some policy implications here, I didn't have time to show it, but when I look analytically at some regression models, kind of looking at these two trends, I found that an individual's health insurance coverage and their access to retirement benefits mattered a lot. So particularly if later life migrants had some sort of health insurance coverage and had retirement benefits, they were kind of the sort of network of who was caring for them looked a little bit more similar to US born. But this is a particularly big problem for later life migrants in particular. So in order to be eligible for Social Security in retirement, you have to have worked in the United States for 10 years. And many people who migrated over the age of 50 have sort of split labor histories, right? They've maybe worked a little bit in their home countries and then a little bit in the United States, but haven't actually made up those 10 years in the United States because perhaps they haven't been here long enough. And then the 1996 welfare reform, which I know Bethany talked about a little bit, one thing as part of this is that there's a 5-year residential requirement for eligibility for both Medicaid and Medicare. So you have to have lived in the US for at least 5 years to be eligible for public health insurance, which many people who arrive in older ages and then need care, sort of long-term care, might not be eligible for. And then finally, we know there's tons of research that shows that there are caregiver penalties for adult children who are providing this unpaid care. And so we may have this issue where children from immigrant families are faced with this kind of intersecting caregiving penalties, immigrant penalties, and racial ethnic penalties in the labor market. Thank you.
Okay, and our third speaker in the panel who will be talking about stratified private safety nets in Latina immigrant families is Vanessa Delgado from Washington State University.
That is such a nice segue because I'm going to be talking specifically about those issues of how young adults are caring for particularly their undocumented parents and how they take on financial responsibility. Okay. All right. So hi, everybody. My name is Vanessa. Thank you to Ariel, Joni for the invitation and the opportunity to be here. I'm really excited to, chat with all of you. Thank you for all those who help behind the scenes. I'm going to be discussing, obviously quickly, a paper that was recently published that focuses on how adult children of immigrants, and I'm going to talk specifically about the adult children of undocumented immigrants and how they have supported their parents, particularly with money. And this is also a book chapter in a book project that I'm working on that focuses on the family labor of adult children of immigrants. Okay. So to get started, I just wanted to just briefly get us into the context of how today's parents are financially supporting their adult children with more money and for longer periods of times compared to previous generations of the past. So that was kind of something that was brought up a little bit ago. And research finds that parents are spending, thousands. There's been reports of $2,000 a year, up to almost $38,000 after their child leaves home, quote unquote, and they're helping their children well into their 30s, right? But within this context, in immigrant families specifically, we see the reverse happen. So we don't just see top-down transfers happen, but we also see sort of bottom-up. And we see that Latino young adults that have immigrant parents are more likely to give back money and are financially supporting their parents more compared to their native-born counterparts. So Latino immigrant families are known to be disproportionately affected by immigration laws, but we have yet to understand how their effects with immigration laws would complicate their experiences of giving back. And so with the paper, I look across different immigration statuses. So the broader research question of the specific paper or the chapter I was looking at was how does parental and self-immigration status shape the financial contributions of immigrant origin Latino young adults? And so for this particular study, I leveraged, and it's also for the book project as well, 60 interviews with young adults that started between December 2018 and January 2020, so before the pandemic hit. And then the pandemic hit. And so in the original 60 interviews, I looked at all college students, and I looked at how were they supporting their parents, how were they, financially helping, how were they helping in, care work type ways, and how did that complicate now that they were college students. So then when the pandemic hit, I followed up. I tried to reach out to the entire sample, but half of the sample was willing to participate or at least, called me back. And that was in the fall of 2020. And so here I try to capture how did COVID-19 impact their family work that they were doing for their parents. And then as a postdoc, I had a little bit of money to be able to do sort of a third wave with the young adults now that they were entering into the world of work, and how was that complicating how they were helping. And so that was in the beginning of 2023. So I don't have all the time to go into the quotes. I do recommend to kind of check out the paper because I think it is kind of powerful. But basically what I found that I'll share today is that young adults with undocumented parents experienced greater financial pressure than the young adults who had documented parents. And by documented parents, I mean those that had lawful permanent residency or were naturalized citizens. And they did so for a number of different reasons. One being that their undocumented parents just had precarious work, and these kinds of work, think like construction or housekeeping, they don't have employee benefits, right, or protections, and they typically paid under the table, quote unquote. Also, because their parents don't have Social Security numbers, they are excluded from, many banking and also individual retirement plans because you need Social Security numbers in order to open that. And then they are prohibited from the federal and state, safety net. And so, things like food stamps, Social Security, things like that, they are not able to apply for. And then I also found that young adults with undocumented parents were more likely to pay household bills. They were more likely to pay household bills even if they did not live with their parents anymore. They felt so bad and compelled to help that many of them no longer live with their parents, but were still financially caring. And they weren't earning a lot of money, too. They were sharing credit cards or taking on credit cards and then helping their parents by having them be authorized users, taking on debt, specifically when there was medical issues. They took on a lot of debt. They made shift retirement plans and even considered limiting future childbearing, where they talked about, I know I'm going to have this responsibility in the future, and so I'm going to limit the number of children I have because I'm not going to be able to afford all this. And so what does that mean? So basically what I find is that private safety nets are stratified by immigration status, that I think my work kind of highlights how the negative intergenerational consequences of illegality and also having a parent who is undocumented. And then finally, I think as we're thinking about laws and policies, especially for our aging population, undocumented immigrants aren't, just these dreamers, right, or the young kids anymore. They're, by 2050, they're going to be a significant part of the undocumented population. And I think it's important to understand the consequences of not having any safety nets for this population and what that means for their adult children. So I just want to say thank you. Here's a QR code if you wanted to check it out, but thank you, and I look forward to chatting.
Okay, we have 6-7 minutes or so for some questions, if our panelists wouldn't mind coming back up here. All right. Fire away. No, I'm just kidding. That's such interesting presentation.
The concept of familismo. I'm also doing work with Latino families, and I'm looking at the concept of familismo. Traditionally, we see familismo as the way of perceiving our families above anything else. But I also feel like in the context of migration specifically, this concept kind of like it's challenged because of the different circumstances that you all described. Just wonder what are your thoughts about that?
I can go ahead. I think in my work, I'm actually kind of critical of familyism, which is kind of, I think it relies on sort of these cultural understandings that it's like, oh, because, of love and so forth. And actually in my book, I have, a chapter that it's called, A Labor of Love with a question mark, because one of the main things that I talked to them about was, why are you doing this work? It's so stressful, you're so overwhelmed, you're spending all this money, you are limiting study hours, and you're constantly going home. Like, why are you doing this? And what I thought was so interesting is that none of them said love. Like, the majority of them were like, well, my mom is undocumented. She can't go to the bank and share those things because she has to keep that private, right? And so that consistently came up. Humanity for immigrants, like, oh, my dad gets disrespected, or I've seen people take advantage of him. I have to help them. So really seeing themselves as advocates, because they felt like, even in professional studies where there are supposed to be sort of translators, right? They still felt like my dad or my parent can still get taken advantage of. And one of the things in this paper that I talk about towards the end is even themselves, they kind of thought about themselves as good kids, right? So even they sort of adopted these tropes of like, I'm doing this because I'm a good kid, it would be bad if I didn't. But I think the range in immigration status is because I had a third of the young adults who were from undocumented families, and they were undocumented and their parent was too. The second third were mixed status, meaning they were citizens, but their parents were undocumented. And then those that, in the third group were, they were citizens and their parents were either naturalized citizens or lawful permanent residents. And it was very clear that those that had undocumented parents were getting a lot more money and also faced a lot more pressure. So I feel like with that, and they were all Latino, they all, technically cared about their parents, right, and stuff like that. But you're able to see, and in the paper I talk about too, with one documented, or actually a number of them talked about how their parents had already reached retirement and they moved back to Mexico because, again, they had papers to be able to do that, right? And how they were able to stretch, the money that they got here to be able to live over there. Of course, we can get into, whether that should be even, a thing, right, that people have to do, but that was an option for them. Or cheap medical care, dentistry. Like I had one participant that her mother wasn't able to go to Mexico. She had this, so it's kind of like, I'm taking too much space here, but basically, I guess in my work, I think I push back a lot because I think that if we highlight, sort of cultural tropes of like, how they love each other and so forth, I think we really miss the opportunity to see how social structures and especially immigration laws are really positioning these young people to take on work that at the end of the day is a burden for them.
I'd say on the flip, I appreciate the criticism, and I sit in that also. But we also just looked at mothers. So in our sample, high rates of depressive symptomology, which we believe is really a structural burden that is borne out in one's mental health. But in our community sample, we're understanding this idea of parental self-sacrifice as also like a strength and a protective factor. So in one sample, in one study, mothers who are experiencing depression and high degrees of immigration stress, they were still exhibiting high degrees of positive parenting. And that's contrary to some of the findings in the literature. And so we've been hypothesizing that you come here to make a better life for your family, and mothers are really positioned in this space of so how is parental self-sacrifice almost a protective factor where they're maybe standing in the way of their own mental health challenges or those burdens, and really focusing on the welfare and the opportunity structure for their children. And so it's sort of an interesting, I just think it's just, there's so much complexity in all of this that
Right.
it makes it very interesting.
So I have a strange question, but this is a big picture labor market question. When I hear you talk, Vanessa, in particular about in Europe, they call it social exclusion. You work, but you have to work under the table in this informal economy. And the dilemma is always, if we brought those people into the social safety net, they would have to pay taxes.
Yes.
Is it worth it? I mean, like, this is the big picture labor market question.
Yeah.
We benefit from cheap maids and childcare services and everything else, in part because we're not paying Social Security taxes. We're not paying income taxes. So what do you think about this larger macro question?
Yeah, and research finds that undocumented immigrants, contribute, billions into, the taxes and stuff like that. And many of them, can be independent contractors, right? And so they pay into services that they might not get out of, ever. I think one of the things, especially when we think about the safety net, it's not as easy, right, to just kind of be like, okay, provide these services and so forth, because California, for instance, and it's a separate project, but I, have followed up with Latina immigrant mothers who now have access. California became the first state to implement Medi-Cal for undocumented immigrants, and so I have pre and post kind of data with that. And one of the things too to highlight is that it's not just taking them out of the shadows and so forth, but we also have this idea of public charge, right? That gets talked a lot in, definitely by the administrations. And public charge is basically this idea of if you are a burden to the U.S., that can complicate your adjustment of status in the future. So if you are a lawful permanent resident, but you're taking too many resources, then that could block you from eventually becoming a naturalized citizen and stuff like that. And so many of the folks that even if they do have access, even for their kids, because undocumented immigrants aren't able to apply for food stamps for themselves, but they are if they have a U.S.-born child. And I saw in my cases that and this is kind of something that young adults kind of reckoned with their parents, because it's not like parents just took everything that their kids were saying and doing at face value and just did it. Like there was like resistance back and forth, where there were many cases where young adults talked about how their parents were making decisions to, even if they, like COVID was a huge one where they didn't want to get COVID testing, they didn't want to go to the doctor. They were like, oh, we don't know what's going to happen with our information, you know what I mean? And so I think with this idea of helping them come out of the shadows, it's not just, giving them access to certain things and so forth, like, a work permit or things like that, but it's also about changing the landscape to be able to make public charge not be an additional barrier too, because there's just so many, like you said, it's just such a complicated thing that I think public charge becomes a big thing that I see, that even if they have access to things, they're still like, yeah. Sorry.
No worries. I just